I never thought I would end up in a cold war with my HOA president over a space heater. But that is exactly where I found myself on a frigid Tuesday morning in January, when Brenda McCarthy knocked on my door with that look on her face. My name is Franklin Davies, and I have lived in the Riverside Meadows community in Columbus, Ohio for 3 years. The neighborhood is one of those planned developments where every house looks vaguely similar, and the HOA bylaws are thicker than a phone book. When I bought my place, a modest 3-bedroom ranch on Willow Creek Lane, I thought the HOA would be a minor annoyance at worst. I had no idea that Brenda McCarthy would turn it into a full-time job just to exist peacefully in my own home. Brenda is everything you would expect from an HOA president on a power trip. She is 52 years old with a blonde bob that never moves in the wind, perfectly manicured nails that she taps impatiently on every surface, and a wardrobe consisting entirely of pastel cardigans and khaki pants. She drives a white Lexus SUV with a vanity plate that reads HOAQN, and she has made it her personal mission to enforce every single rule in our community guidelines with the zeal of a federal prosecutor. The trouble started back in November when the furnace in my house began making concerning noises. I called a heating specialist, who told me the system was on its last legs and would need to be replaced before winter really set in. The quote he gave me was $8,000. I had the money saved, but I also had a debt that needed to be settled first. You see, 6 months earlier, Brenda had convinced the HOA board to approve a special assessment for new landscaping at the community entrance. The cost was divided among all 70 homes in Riverside Meadows, coming out to $1,200 per household. The problem was that Brenda had hired her brother-in-law to do the work, and he did an absolutely terrible job. The plants died within a month, the irrigation system never worked properly, and the decorative rocks he installed washed away in the first heavy rain. I was not the only homeowner who was furious. At least 20 of us filed formal complaints with the board, demanding that the work be redone properly or that we get our money back. Brenda stonewalled us at every meeting, insisting that the work had been completed to specification and that any issues were due to weather conditions beyond anyone's control. She refused to acknowledge that her brother-in-law had pocketed our money and delivered substandard work. After months of getting nowhere, I decided to withhold my $1,200 payment until the issue was resolved. I sent Brenda a certified letter explaining my position and noting that Ohio law allows homeowners to withhold payments for work that is not completed satisfactorily. Several other homeowners did the same thing. Brenda responded by placing a lien on my property and threatening legal action. I consulted with a real estate attorney named Margaret Chen, who told me that Brenda was overstepping her authority and that the lien was likely not enforceable given the circumstances. Margaret sent Brenda a letter outlining the legal problems with her approach, but Brenda doubled down. She started sending me violation notices for the most trivial things imaginable. My trash can was visible from the street for 30 minutes past the pickup time. My mailbox post needed repainting. My lawn had 3 dandelions. Each violation came with a $50 fine. I contested every single one, but the board always sided with Brenda. By December, I had racked up over $600 in fines that I refused to pay on principal. Meanwhile, my furnace finally gave out completely on December 20th, right as temperatures dropped into the teens. I could not afford to replace it immediately because I was saving my money for the legal battle with the HOA. I had principles, and I was not going to let Brenda bully me into paying for work that was never done properly. So I bought 3 space heaters from the hardware store on Route 161 heavy-duty ceramic models that could heat a decent-sized room. I set one up in my bedroom, one in my living room, and one in my home office where I work remotely as a software developer. It was not ideal, but it kept me warm enough to function. That brings us back to that Tuesday morning in January. I was working at my desk, my space heater humming away beside me, when I heard the aggressive knock that could only belong to Brenda. I considered not answering, but I knew she would just keep knocking or send me another violation notice for not responding to official HOA business. I opened the door to find her standing on my porch with her arms crossed, her breath forming clouds in the 20-degree air. "Franklin, we need to talk about your electric usage." "Good morning to you too, Brenda. What about my electric usage?" "You are using space heaters, multiple space heaters. Do you have any idea how much electricity those things consume?" "You are overloading the shared transformer that services this section of the neighborhood. The electric company called me personally to complain." I seriously doubted that the electric company had called her personally about anything, but I played along. "My furnace is broken. I am keeping myself from freezing to death. That seems like a pretty reasonable use of electricity." "Then fix your furnace. You cannot just run space heaters indefinitely. It is creating a fire hazard and driving up costs for everyone." "I will fix my furnace as soon as I have the money, which will be as soon as the HOA refunds the $1,200 I paid for landscaping work that was never done properly." Brenda's face turned pink, a sure sign that her blood pressure was rising. "That matter has been settled. The work was completed according to contract. The plants died in 3 weeks. There is no grass at the entrance, just mud and weeds. That is not completed according to contract. Those are maintenance issues, not installation issues. The board has voted and your complaint has been denied. You still owe that assessment plus the $600 in fines. If you do not pay, we will be forced to foreclose on your property. You cannot foreclose for $1,800. No court would allow it." "Try me," she said, and there was something cold in her eyes that made me wonder if she actually believed she could pull it off. "In the meantime, I am going to need you to stop using those space heaters. They are not approved appliances under our community guidelines." I actually laughed at that. "You are telling me that space heaters are not approved appliances? Where exactly does it say that?" Section 12, subsection 4. "All heating appliances must be permanently installed and inspected by a certified professional. Space heaters are temporary appliances and therefore not permitted for long-term use." I knew she was grasping at straws. Section 12, subsection 4 was about hot water heaters and furnaces, not space heaters. But Brenda had a habit of interpreting the rules in whatever way suited her purposes. "Brenda, I am not turning off my space heaters. It is 20 degrees outside and my furnace is broken. You cannot expect me to freeze in my own home." "Then fix your furnace today. If those space heaters are still running by this evening, I will have no choice but to take action." "What kind of action? Are you going to break into my house and unplug them?" She gave me a tight smile. "I do not need to break in. I have the authority to shut off power to any unit that is creating a safety hazard. Article 23 of the Community Guidelines. The HOA has the right to access utility controls in emergency situations. This is not an emergency situation. That is for me to decide. I am the president." She turned and walked back to her Lexus, leaving me standing in the cold doorway. I knew she was bluffing about shutting off my power. That would be illegal, plain and simple. But Brenda had shown time and again that she did not care much about what was legal versus what she thought she could get away with. I went back inside and called Margaret Chen. I explained what had just happened and asked if Brenda actually had the authority to shut off my electricity. Margaret's response was immediate and emphatic. Absolutely not. That would be an illegal eviction under Ohio law. Even if the HOA had grounds to take action against you, which they do not, they cannot shut off your utilities without a court order. If she tries it, call the police immediately and then call me. We will sue her and the HOA board personally. That made me feel better, but it also made me realize that this situation was escalating beyond anything reasonable. I decided to take a different approach. If Brenda wanted to play hardball, I could play too. I spent the afternoon doing research. I pulled up the community guidelines, the HOA bylaws, and every piece of correspondence I had received from Brenda over the past 6 months. I also looked into her personal situation, which was not hard since she loved to talk about herself at neighborhood events. What I found was interesting. Brenda's husband, Tom McCarthy, ran a small contracting business. They lived in one of the larger homes in Riverside Meadows, a 2-story colonial on Oak Ridge Drive. And most importantly, Brenda rented out her garage as storage space to 3 different neighbors. She charged each of them $150 a month for the privilege of keeping their extra boxes and seasonal decorations in her oversized 2-car garage. This was a clear violation of the HOA rules. Section 8 explicitly prohibited commercial activities on residential properties. Renting out storage space definitely qualified as a commercial activity. I made copies of the relevant sections and then did something I probably should not have done. I walked over to Brenda's house around 4 in the afternoon when I knew she would be home. Her Lexus was in the driveway. I knocked on her front door. She opened it with an annoyed expression. "Franklin, what do you want?" "I want to make you an offer. Drop the demands about my space heaters, refund my $1,200 for the landscaping work, and waive the bogus fines. In exchange, I will not file a formal complaint about your illegal storage rental business." Her expression went from annoyed to furious in about half a second. "Excuse me, you are renting out your garage as storage space. That is a commercial activity, which violates Section 8 of the Community Guidelines. If I report it to the board, you will be fined. If you do not stop, the HOA could take action against you. Of course, as president, you could just choose not to enforce that rule against yourself, but then I would have grounds to sue the entire board for selective enforcement. You are threatening me. I am negotiating, just like you have been negotiating with me for the past 6 months. The difference is that your violations are real and documented, while your complaints about my space heaters are nonsense. Get off my property. Think about it, Brenda. We can both walk away from this, or we can both lose. Your choice." I turned and walked back home, my heart pounding. I had never been good at confrontation, but something about Brenda's attitude brought out a stubborn streak in me. If she wanted to make my life miserable, I was going to return the favor. That evening, around 7 o'clock, my lights flickered and then went out completely. My space heaters stopped humming. My computer shut down. I was sitting in complete darkness in my freezing house. I grabbed my phone and used the flashlight to navigate to my electrical panel. I checked the main breaker, but it had not tripped. I went outside to check the meter and found that the power was definitely off, but only to my house. My neighbors on both sides still had their lights on. Brenda had actually done it. She had shut off my power. I called the police first, then Margaret Chen. The dispatcher told me an officer would be there within 30 minutes. Margaret told me to document everything and assured me that this was going to cost Brenda and the HOA dearly. Officer James Rivera arrived 25 minutes later. He was a stocky guy in his 40s with a no-nonsense attitude. I explained the situation, showed him the emails and letters from Brenda, and walked him through the timeline of events. He took notes and then asked me where the HOA president lived. We walked over to Brenda's house together. Officer Rivera knocked on the door with the solid, authoritative knock that only cops can pull off. Brenda answered with a smile that died the moment she saw the police officer. "Evening, madam. I am Officer Rivera with Columbus PD. I understand you shut off this gentleman's electricity." "I did no such thing. I do not have access to the electrical systems." "Madam, his power is off and his neighbor's power is on. He tells me you threatened to shut off his power this morning due to a dispute over space heaters. That is an illegal eviction under Ohio law." "It is not an eviction. It is an enforcement of community safety regulations. As HOA president, I have the authority to take emergency action when residents create hazardous conditions. Using space heaters is not a hazardous condition. Shutting off someone's power in January is. I am going to need you to turn his power back on immediately, or I will have to take you in for questioning regarding illegal eviction and reckless endangerment." "This is ridiculous. I am the victim here. He has been violating HOA rules for months." "I do not care about HOA rules. I care about Ohio law, and you have broken it. Turn his power back on now." Brenda glared at me with pure hatred, but she grabbed a coat and walked with us to a utility box at the corner of the street. She produced a key from her pocket and opened the box, revealing several switches and circuit breakers. She flipped one of them, and I saw the lights come back on in my house. "Thank you, madam. Now I am going to strongly suggest that you do not attempt anything like this again. If I get another call about you shutting off utilities, I will arrest you on the spot. Is that clear?" "Perfectly clear," Brenda said through gritted teeth. Officer Rivera turned to me. "Sir, I recommend you contact a lawyer about this situation. You may have grounds for a restraining order or a civil suit." "I already have a lawyer. She is going to be very interested to hear about this." Rivera nodded and headed back to his patrol car. Brenda and I stood there in the cold for a moment. "You are going to regret this," she said quietly. "I already regret buying a house in a neighborhood with an HOA president who thinks she is above the law. But here we are." I went back home and cranked up my space heaters. Then I called Margaret and filled her in on what had happened. She was almost gleeful. "This is perfect. We can file a civil suit for harassment, illegal eviction, and emotional distress. We can also report her to the state HOA Oversight Board for abuse of authority. And if you want to get really aggressive, we can push for her removal as HOA president. I just want her to leave me alone and give me my money back. Trust me, after this, you will get both of those things and more. Let me draft some letters and I will send them to the HOA board tomorrow. In the meantime, keep documenting everything." I went to bed that night feeling both vindicated and anxious. I had won this round, but I knew Brenda well enough to know she would not let it go. The next morning, I found a notice taped to my front door. It was from the HOA board, informing me of an emergency meeting to discuss my violations and my future in the community. The meeting was scheduled for Friday evening at the community center. I forwarded the notice to Margaret, who told me not to worry. She would attend the meeting with me and make sure everything was handled properly. The next few days were tense. I kept waiting for Brenda to retaliate somehow, but she seemed to be lying low. I saw her driving around the neighborhood in her Lexus, probably inspecting everyone's properties for violations, but she did not approach my house. On Thursday afternoon, I got a call from one of my neighbors, a retired teacher named Robert Finch who lived 3 houses down from me. Robert was one of the homeowners who had also withheld payment for the landscaping assessment. "Franklin, I do not know what you did, but Brenda showed up at my house this morning demanding access to my garage. She claimed she needed to inspect it for code violations. I told her to come back with a warrant. Did she say what kind of code violations? Something about storage regulations. It was bizarre. She seemed really agitated. I thanked Robert for the heads up and immediately understood what was happening. Brenda was going after the other homeowners who were storing things in her garage. She was probably trying to clear out her illegal storage business before I could file a formal complaint. That gave me an idea. I spent Thursday evening walking around the neighborhood and talking to people. I wanted to know how many other homeowners had issues with Brenda and the HOA board. What I found was eye-opening. Out of 70 homes in Riverside Meadows, at least 40 had received violation notices in the past year. Most of them were for trivial issues like the ones Brenda had hit me with. Several homeowners told me they had simply paid the fines because they did not want to deal with the hassle of fighting the HOA. A few had tried to contest the violations but had been overruled by the board, which always sided with Brenda. I also learned that Brenda had been HOA president for 4 years, and in that time, she had pushed through 3 separate special assessments totaling over $4,000 per household. The money had supposedly gone to various improvements around the neighborhood, but several people told me they had never seen any actual work completed beyond the disastrous landscaping project. By Friday afternoon, I had compiled a list of complaints and documentation from 23 different homeowners. I made copies of everything and put together a presentation for the emergency board meeting. Margaret met me at my house at 6:30. She was a sharp woman in her mid-40s with short dark hair and an intense focus that made her excellent at her job. She reviewed my documentation and nodded approvingly. "This is good work. We have enough here to show a pattern of harassment and financial mismanagement. Even if the board tries to rule against you tonight, we can use this in court." We drove to the community center together. The meeting was scheduled for 7 o'clock, and when we arrived, the parking lot was already packed. Apparently, word had spread about the emergency meeting, and a lot of homeowners wanted to see what would happen. The community center was a modest building with a large multi-purpose room that the HOA used for meetings and neighborhood events. When we walked in, I was shocked to see at least 60 people already seated. That was more than had ever attended an HOA meeting in the 3 years I had lived there. Brenda was at the front of the room, seated at a table with the other 4 board members. There was Gerald Simpson, the vice president, a bald man in his 60s who always seemed half asleep during meetings. Next to him was Patricia Hanover, the treasurer, a nervous woman who avoided eye contact with everyone. Then there was David Lee, the secretary, a quiet guy in his 30s who took notes but rarely spoke. Finally, there was Maureen Foster, a member-at-large who had been on the board for 2 years and seemed to genuinely care about the community. Brenda called the meeting to order at 7 o'clock sharp. She started with a long speech about the importance of community standards and how every homeowner had agreed to follow the rules when they purchased their property. Then she turned her attention to me. "We are here tonight to address the ongoing violations by Franklin Davies. Mr. Davies has refused to pay his special assessment, has accumulated over $600 in fines for various rule violations, and is currently using unapproved heating appliances that pose a safety risk to the entire neighborhood. The board has been patient, but we cannot allow one homeowner to disregard our community guidelines with impunity." Margaret stood up before I could respond. "Excuse me, Miss McCarthy, but I am Margaret Chen, Mr. Davies' legal counsel. Before we proceed, I need to address several serious issues with this meeting and with your conduct as HOA president." Brenda looked irritated. "This is a closed board meeting. Your presence was not approved." Actually, under Ohio HOA law, any homeowner has the right to have legal representation at disciplinary hearings. This is clearly a disciplinary hearing since you are discussing sanctions against my client. If you refuse to allow me to participate, we can end this meeting right now and continue the discussion in court. Gerald Simpson leaned over and whispered something to Brenda. She looked like she had swallowed something bitter, but she nodded. Fine. You may stay. But please keep your comments brief. Thank you. First, regarding the special assessment for landscaping work, my client and 22 other homeowners have documented that the work was not completed according to specification. The contractor failed to deliver what was promised, and the HOA board has refused to address the issue. Under Ohio law, homeowners have the right to withhold payment for work that is not satisfactorily completed. The work was completed, Brenda interrupted. The contractor fulfilled his obligations under the contract. Then, perhaps you can explain why all the plants died within a month, why the irrigation system never functioned properly, and why the decorative rock was washed away in the first rain. I have photographs from multiple homeowners documenting these failures. Margaret pulled out a folder and began passing around copies of photos showing the entrance to Riverside Meadows. The images clearly showed dead plants, exposed dirt, and a generally shabby appearance that looked nothing like the original design proposal. Patricia Hanover looked at the photos and frowned. I did not realize it was this bad. That is because Miss McCarthy has been preventing board members from properly reviewing homeowner complaints, Margaret continued. I have copies of emails from several homeowners attempting to bring these issues to the board's attention, only to be told by Miss McCarthy that the matter was closed. That is not true, Brenda said, but her voice lacked conviction. Second, regarding the violation fines against my client, we believe these are retaliatory in nature. Mr. Davies received no violation notices for 3 years, but suddenly began receiving multiple notices per month immediately after he withheld payment for the landscaping assessment. This is a clear pattern of harassment. We increased our enforcement efforts across the entire community, Brenda said. Mr. Davies was not singled out. Then why do I have statements from 17 other homeowners stating that they also began receiving increased violation notices after complaining about the landscaping work? And why do those violation notices consistently involve trivial issues like temporary trash can visibility or single dandelions, while more serious violations by homeowners who did not complain are being ignored? Maureen Foster raised her hand. Brenda, is this true? Have we been selectively enforcing rules? Of course not. Every violation is documented and legitimate. Third, Margaret said, raising her voice slightly, we have the issue of Miss McCarthy shutting off power to my client's home 2 days ago. This was an illegal eviction and constitutes a criminal act. Columbus Police Department has a report on file, and Officer Rivera specifically ordered Miss McCarthy not to take any similar action in the future. That caused a ripple of conversation throughout the room. Several people pulled out their phones and started texting. Brenda's face turned red. That was an emergency safety measure. Mr. Davies was overloading the electrical system with his space heaters. You have any evidence of an overloaded system? Any report from the electric company or a certified electrician stating that there was a safety hazard? Brenda did not answer. I will take that as a no. What you did was retaliate against my client for standing up to you, and you broke the law doing it. Now, I could go on. I could talk about how you have been running an illegal storage rental business out of your garage, in violation of the community guidelines. I could talk about the 3 special assessments you have pushed through in 4 years, totaling over $4,000 per household, with little to show for it. I could talk about your brother-in-law being awarded the landscaping contract without a competitive bidding process. But instead, I am going to make you an offer. The room went completely silent. Everyone was staring at Margaret. Drop all violation fines against my client. Refund the $1,200 landscaping assessment to him and to any other homeowner who requests it. Resign as HOA president effective immediately. In exchange, my client will not pursue criminal charges for the illegal eviction, and he will not file a civil suit against you personally or against the board. Brenda stood up so fast that her chair fell backward. This is outrageous. You cannot come in here and make demands like that. I just did. You have until the end of this meeting to decide. If you refuse, we will be in court Monday morning, and I promise you that the discovery process will be very thorough. Every contract you have approved, every fine you have levied, every email you have sent will be examined in detail. And I suspect we will find a lot more than just the issues I have mentioned tonight. Gerald Simpson cleared his throat. Perhaps we should take a short recess to discuss this privately. No, Maureen Foster said firmly. I want to hear what other homeowners have to say. This is supposed to be an open meeting, right? Let's hear from the community. What followed was an hour of homeowners standing up and sharing their experiences with Brenda and the HOA board. Robert Finch talked about the landscaping assessment and how he had been threatened with foreclosure for withholding payment. A woman named Susan Miller described receiving 12 violation notices in 3 months for issues like her porch light being the wrong color temperature. A young couple named the Kowalskis explained how they had been fined $500 for planting flowers in their front yard without prior approval, even though the community guidelines specifically allowed flower gardens. The stories kept coming, and with each one, Brenda looked smaller and angrier. Patricia Hanover looked increasingly uncomfortable. David Lee kept taking notes with a stunned expression. Gerald Simpson just sat there looking tired. Finally, Maureen Foster stood up. I have heard enough. Brenda, I am calling for a vote of no confidence in your leadership as HOA president. All those in favor. Patricia raised her hand immediately. David hesitated, then raised his. Gerald looked at Brenda, then slowly raised his hand as well. The motion passes 4-1. Brenda McCarthy is removed as HOA president effective immediately. I am temporarily assuming the role until we can hold a proper election. Brenda grabbed her purse and stormed out of the community center without another word. About half the room applauded. The other half sat in shocked silence. Maureen turned to me. Mr. Davies, on behalf of the board, I apologize for how you have been treated. We will refund your landscaping assessment and waive all fines. We will also be conducting a full review of all HOA finances and contracts to ensure everything has been handled properly. Thank you, I said. I appreciate that. The meeting continued for another 30 minutes as Maureen outlined plans for reforming how the HOA operated. She promised more transparency, regular financial audits, and a fair process for homeowners to contest violations. Several people volunteered to serve on committees to help implement the changes. As Margaret and I walked back to our cars, I felt a huge weight lift off my shoulders. That went better than I expected, I told her. You did good work. You stood up for yourself and you helped a lot of other people in the process. That takes courage. Send me your bill. I imagine tonight cost me a fortune in legal fees. She smiled. Actually, after what just happened, I think several other homeowners are going to want to hire me to review their HOA disputes. Consider tonight a free consultation. You brought me a lot of potential business. I went home and cranked up my space heaters, enjoying the warmth and the knowledge that I did not have to look over my shoulder anymore. The next morning, I called the heating company and scheduled an appointment to have my furnace replaced. Without the financial burden of the HOA fines, and with the refunded assessment, I could easily afford it. The furnace installation happened the following Wednesday. The technician did excellent work, and by that evening I had proper heat running through my house for the first time in weeks. I packed up the space heaters and stored them in my basement, hoping I would never need them again. Things were quiet for about a week. Then, on a Thursday afternoon, I got a call from Maureen Foster. "Franklin, I wanted to update you on something. We hired a forensic accountant to review the HOA books. It turns out Brenda has been skimming money from the association for at least 2 years. We are talking about tens of thousands of dollars." "Are you serious?" "Completely serious. The accountant found multiple irregularities. Inflated contractor bills that did not match actual work performed. Reimbursements to Brenda for expenses that were never documented. It is a mess. We are meeting with the police tomorrow to file a formal complaint." "What about the other board members? Were they involved?" "It does not look like it. Patricia was treasurer, but Brenda handled most of the actual financial work and just gave Patricia summaries to present at meetings. Gerald and David were kept in the dark completely. They are cooperating fully with the investigation." "What happens now?" "The HOA will likely file a civil suit to recover the stolen funds. The police will investigate whether criminal charges are warranted, and we will need to hold a special election for a new board. Would you be interested in running? A lot of people have mentioned your name." "Thanks, but no thanks. I just want to live quietly without HOA drama," Maureen laughed. "I understand completely. Well, if you change your mind, let me know." 2 weeks later, I was leaving for work when I saw a Columbus police cruiser parked in front of Brenda's house. 2 officers were walking up to her door. I did not stop to watch. But later that day, the neighborhood message board exploded with news that Brenda had been arrested for theft and embezzlement. According to the police report that was eventually made public, Brenda had stolen over $48,000 from the HOA over a 2.5-year period. She had done it through a combination of fake invoices, inflated expenses, and direct transfers to her personal accounts. Her husband Tom claimed he had no knowledge of the theft, and investigators seemed to believe him. Brenda had kept her HOA finances completely separate from their household accounts. The case moved surprisingly quickly through the legal system. Brenda's lawyer tried to negotiate a plea deal, but the prosecutor was not interested. The evidence was overwhelming, and the amount of money involved pushed it into felony territory. Brenda went to trial in April. I was called to testify about my experiences with the HOA, and about how Brenda had retaliated against me for questioning her authority. My testimony was not directly related to the theft charges, but the prosecutor wanted to establish a pattern of behavior showing that Brenda believed she was above the rules. Margaret came with me to the courthouse for moral support. The trial lasted 3 days. The forensic accountant presented detailed evidence of the financial irregularities. Patricia Hanover testified about how Brenda had controlled all access to the HOA bank accounts. Several homeowners testified about the special assessments and the lack of completed work. Brenda's defense was weak. Her lawyer tried to argue that she had simply made bookkeeping errors and that there was no criminal intent. But the sheer volume of irregularities and the sophistication of the schemes made that argument laughable. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. They found Brenda guilty on 8 counts of theft and 2 counts of falsifying records. At sentencing 3 weeks later, The judge gave her 4 years in prison and ordered her to pay full restitution to the HOA. I was not in the courtroom for the sentencing, but Maureen called me afterward to fill me in. She said Brenda had cried and claimed she never meant to hurt anyone, that she had just gotten in over her head financially and had made poor choices. The judge was not sympathetic. Life in Riverside Meadows slowly returned to normal after that. The HOA held elections in May, and a slate of new board members was chosen. The new board was much more reasonable and transparent. They published detailed financial reports every quarter and held monthly open meetings where homeowners could raise concerns. The entrance landscaping was redone properly by a reputable company selected through a competitive bidding process. The new plants thrived, the irrigation system worked perfectly, and the entrance actually looked beautiful for the first time since I had moved in. I never did run for the HOA board, but I started attending meetings regularly just to stay informed. It was remarkable how different the atmosphere was without Brenda. People were friendly and cooperative. Disputes were resolved through reasonable discussion rather than threats and fines. As for the space heaters that had started this whole mess, they stayed in my basement for several months. Then, in December, my neighbor Susan Miller knocked on my door looking embarrassed. "Franklin, I hate to ask, but do you still have those space heaters? My furnace just died and I cannot get anyone out to fix it until after Christmas. I would be happy to pay you for them." I smiled and told her the space heaters were free to borrow for as long as she needed them. After everything that had happened, it felt good to help someone out without any drama or complications. Susan borrowed the heaters for about a week until her furnace was repaired. When she returned them, she brought me a plate of homemade cookies and a card thanking me for being a good neighbor. It was such a simple, normal interaction, but it meant a lot after all the conflict with Brenda. In January, almost exactly 1 year after Brenda had demanded I turn off my space heaters, I found myself thinking about how much had changed. I had gone from dreading every interaction with the HOA to actually feeling like I was part of a real community. The new board had implemented reasonable rules and fair enforcement. Homeowners were working together to improve the neighborhood instead of fighting with each other. I also thought about Brenda, sitting in a prison cell somewhere, probably still convinced that she had been treated unfairly. Part of me felt bad for her. She had destroyed her own life through greed and arrogance. But another part of me recognized that she had brought it all on herself. If she had just been reasonable, if she had listened to homeowners' legitimate complaints, none of this would have happened. The money she stole was eventually repaid through a combination of the sale of her house and payments from her personal accounts. The HOA used the recovered funds to make real improvements around the neighborhood, new playground equipment at the community center, repairs to the walking paths, and proper lighting at the entrance. I ran into Tom McCarthy once at the grocery store on Route 161. He looked like he had aged 10 years. We made awkward eye contact and he started to say something, then just shook his head and walked away. I heard from neighbors that he had moved to an apartment across town after the house was sold. I felt sorry for him. He had lost his home and his wife's income because of choices he had not made. By spring, the whole ordeal felt like a distant memory. I had a functioning furnace, a reasonable HOA, and no outstanding disputes with anyone in the neighborhood. I had learned some valuable lessons about standing up for myself and about the importance of community accountability. Margaret Chen sent me a card in March thanking me for the referrals. She said she had picked up 5 new clients from Riverside Meadows and had successfully resolved several HOA disputes using the precedent from my case. She joked that I should consider a career in community organizing. The story of Brenda's downfall became something of a legend in local HOA circles. I heard from friends in other neighborhoods that their HOA presidents had become noticeably more careful about following proper procedures and maintaining transparent finances. Nobody wanted to end up like Brenda McCarthy, the HOA president who went to prison over stolen dues and a vendetta against a homeowner with space heaters. In June, I was invited to speak at a community forum about HOA reform. The event was organized by a statewide homeowners' rights group that was pushing for stronger oversight of HOA boards. I talked about my experience, emphasizing the importance of documentation, knowing your rights, and being willing to stand up to bullies even when it is uncomfortable. After my talk, several people came up to share their own HOA horror stories. I was amazed at how common these problems were. So many people had dealt with power-hungry board members, questionable financial practices, and selective rule enforcement. Many of them had simply paid fines and assessments rather than fight, not realizing they had legal options. I connected several of these people with Margaret, who was building a reputation as an HOA specialist attorney. I also encouraged them to attend their HOA meetings and to run for their boards if they wanted to see change. It was surprising how much power an engaged homeowner could have. By the time summer arrived, I had fully settled into my new normal. I worked from my home office, attended HOA meetings occasionally, and enjoyed living in a neighborhood that actually felt like a community. The whole experience with Brenda had been exhausting and frustrating, but it had also taught me something important about not backing down when you know you are right. One evening in July, I was sitting on my back porch with a beer, watching the sunset and feeling grateful for the peaceful life I had now. My phone buzzed with a text from Robert Finch, asking if I wanted to join him and some other neighbors for a cookout the following weekend. I texted back that I would be there. As I sat there in the warm evening air, I thought about that cold January morning when Brenda had knocked on my door and demanded I turn off my space heaters. At the time, it had seemed like just another absurd demand from an unreasonable person. I never could have imagined that refusing to comply would ultimately lead to exposing widespread financial fraud and reforming an entire HOA. The space heaters themselves, those 3 ceramic units that had caused so much trouble, were still in my basement. I had no plans to use them since my furnace was working perfectly, but I decided to keep them anyway. They were a reminder that sometimes the smallest acts of resistance can lead to the biggest changes. I finished my beer and went inside, looking forward to whatever came next. Life in Riverside Meadows was finally everything I had hoped it would be when I first bought my house. The HOA was functional and fair. The neighborhood was friendly and cooperative. And I had learned that standing up for yourself, even when it is hard and uncomfortable, is always worth it in the end. The following Saturday, I went to Robert's cookout. About 20 neighbors showed up, including several members of the new HOA board. We ate burgers and talked about normal things like upcoming vacations and the Columbus Clippers baseball season. Nobody mentioned Brenda or HOA drama. It was just a group of people enjoying each other's company on a summer evening. As I drove home that night, I realized that this was what community was supposed to feel like. Not a collection of rules and fines and violations, but actual human connections between people who happen to live near each other. Brenda had tried to turn the HOA into her personal fiefdom, a way to exert control and make money. But in the end, her greed and vindictiveness had brought her down and had given the rest of us a chance to build something better. I never saw Brenda again after the trial. I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that she was serving her sentence at the Ohio Reformatory for Women in Marysville, about an hour north of Columbus. I did not wish her any particular harm, but I also did not waste any sympathy on her. She had made her choices, and now she was living with the consequences. As for my space heaters, they stayed in the basement, a silent reminder of the battle that had changed everything. Every time I walked past them, I thought about how something so simple and ordinary had become the flashpoint for exposing corruption and abuse of power. It was a reminder that you never know which hill will be the one worth dying on until you find yourself standing on it. The months turned into years, and life in Riverside Meadows continued to improve. The new HOA board implemented smart policies that balanced community standards with individual freedom. Fines were reserved for actual problems, not petty grievances. Special assessments were approved only after thorough vetting and community input. Financial records were posted online for anyone to review. I eventually did join the HOA board, serving a 2-year term as treasurer. It was more work than I expected, but it was also rewarding to help maintain the positive changes that had come from that difficult period. I made sure that every penny was accounted for, and that all financial decisions were made transparently. I never wanted to see another Brenda McCarthy situation develop on my watch. Looking back now, I can see how that cold January confrontation over space heaters was a turning point not just for me, but for the entire community. It forced everyone to examine how much power we had given to one person and how little oversight we had demanded. It showed us that speaking up and fighting back, even when it is difficult, can lead to real change. And it all started because a petty tyrant with a blonde bob and a power complex decided that my space heaters were a bigger problem than her own corruption. In trying to punish me for standing up to her, she set in motion a chain of events that exposed her crimes and ended her reign of terror over Riverside Meadows. The space heaters still sit in my basement, gathering dust. I have not needed them since that first winter, and I probably never will again, but I will never get rid of them. They are a trophy of sorts, evidence that sometimes the smallest things can spark the biggest changes, and that standing up to a bully, even when it costs you something, is always the right choice. My furnace runs perfectly now, keeping my house warm through the Ohio winters. The HOA operates fairly and transparently. The neighborhood thrives with good people working together. And somewhere in Marysville, Brenda McCarthy sits in a prison cell, probably still convinced that she was the victim in all of this. But she was not the victim. She was the architect of her own destruction, brought down by her greed, her vindictiveness, and her fundamental misunderstanding of what it means to serve a community rather than rule over it. And it all started because she demanded my space heaters on a cold January morning, and I decided that enough was enough.